Hello, everyone. As Dean of Faculty, it's my honor to welcome all of you to this community-wide celebration of the inauguration of Dartmouth's 17th president, Dr. Jim Young Kim. Our celebration is beginning right now with this very special panel titled Reflections on Leadership for Social Change. And Dr. Kim certainly embodies the spirit that this panel celebrates. As Dartmouth's first physician president and an academic anthropologist, he is also a world leader in global health and a lifelong learner and teacher. I already see that he has a gift for pushing us to do our very best and to help change the world. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming our new president, President Jim Young Kim.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you so much. Please have a seat. But before he takes a seat, I'd like to recognize Jim Wright. And Susan. And Susan. And let me say once again, Jim and Susan built the institution and built up Dartmouth College in a way that made it possible for me to be present. I'll forever be grateful to you, Jim. Thank you. Now, I've got a little bit of a problem here because I was shouting so much at the football game on Saturday, I'm kind of losing my voice. So I'll be very brief, but let me just say that this panel was really my own dream panel. These are all such important people. Sid Finkelstein, the moderator, is the Stephen Roth Professor of Management. He is a world-renowned authority on strategy, and he was one of the first professors that I've ever met at Dartmouth College. He is an advisor to me, and we're very happy that he's agreed to moderate the panel. Jeff Immelt, class of 1978, played offensive tackle on the football team at Dartmouth, tried out for the Cleveland Browns. Oh, and by the way, he's also CEO of General Electric. I can't tell you what it means to me to be in the trustee room meeting talking about what it means to run Dartmouth College and having perennially one of the top CEOs in the world right there helping us out and giving me advice. It's just astounding. Ed Haldeman is the chair of the board and is one of the most important reasons that I'm here now at Dartmouth College. When I met Ed, I learned that, among other things, he was a first-generation college student. He is currently chair of the Board of Trustees and CEO of Freddie Mac. But Ed's distinctive, the very distinctive thing about Ed that everyone knows is that Ed brings with him to even the most complex financial job a sense of ethics, integrity that now have led him to take on one of the most difficult challenges in the United States. Ruth Simmons of Brown University is the president of the place that I went to school, but she's also become one of my most important mentors. I actually have a wristband that I'm going to start wearing that says WWRD, what would Ruth do? And already, on several occasions, I've already reached out to her when there was something that happened or some issue that we had to deal with that was especially difficult. I call her, and often within minutes, she'll call me back. In the Confucian tradition, my mother is a Neo-Confucian scholar, and in the Confucian tradition, it takes a long time to become a person who's recognized as a sage. Ruth is the sage, And she's a sage among college presidents, and I'm so grateful to have her as a mentor and guide. Mike Porter is someone I met just 3 years ago, but I have to say that he has influenced my thinking almost as much as anyone, except maybe the person sitting next to him. But Mike is the global guru for strategy. And when I first was told that, look, if you're really interested in healthcare delivery and how to set up systems that work on delivering on goals, you got to talk to Michael Porter. And I said, you mean the Michael Porter? At Harvard Business School, actually, they call him the Michael. Mike is a person who advises heads of state, the heads of all the major corporations, but because he wanted to help us be better at delivering healthcare in poor countries, he spent 2 weeks with us in Rwanda trying to figure out how we did our work so that he could help us figure it out. Mike has a huge heart and is and will continue to be a guide for me. So Paul Farmer has been called the Albert Schweitzer, or the Mother Teresa of our time. Actually, he's a lot better than that. The most important thing about Paul Farmer is that he is godfather to my 2 children. And I have to say that one of the most encouraging things that I have seen in my entire life is the extent to which young people are moved and motivated by the example that Paul sets. I could go on and on about how this man has a reservoir of patience and compassion unlike any human being I've ever seen. And so let me introduce to you our wonderful panel and our wonderful moderator, Sid Finkelstein.
Thank you, Jim, and it's just terrific to have the honor of moderating this panel. People that I've known for a few years, some that even as a PhD student I read much of his work. That's Mike Porter, of course, and reading books of Paul Farmer and others. It's a tremendous opportunity. And our goal really is to have if we could, an informal discussion. There are a few key topics, of course, on leadership, on social change, on learning, on personal development that I think will be interesting. And I thought I should start, especially given what Jim just said, with President Ruth Simmons, because we want to know what would Ruth do. Your life story by any measure is remarkable. Growing up as the youngest of 12 children in a Texas sharecropper family, you went to college, you earned a PhD at Harvard. You were a senior administrator at Princeton, the president at Simmons, and now for the last 8 years, the president at Brown University. And all of this is a tremendous testament to, well, that's what I want to ask you about. To what? To hard work, to intellect, to luck, to the benefits of mentorship, to passion. Can you share with us, as you look back, one anecdote or example or story that was particularly pivotal in your career and the career path that you've taken?
Thank you. I would, for any Smithies in the audience, they would be very upset if I didn't correct you. I was president of Smith, so. But in all fairness to you, let me say that the whole time I was president of Smith, people always introduced me as President Smith from Simmons. So it's very natural for people to do it. First of all, let me say how excited I am to be here. I don't think I've been this excited about a presidential inauguration since my own. So I'm really, that's not a political statement at all. I'm an Obama supporter, but I'm so heartened and delighted that this community has selected such a superb and inspiring individual as a leader. To the question you asked, I would say that when I was a girl, I had the good fortune to walk into a classroom one day and find in that classroom a teacher who had the ability to show me what was possible in life. And I actually think that had I not walked into that classroom, I probably wouldn't be here today. So I think this question of mentoring is enormously important, particularly because we are never sure when nor how we will stumble upon that person who will change our lives in some dramatic way. She happened to be a high school teacher of speech and drama, and I was a very, I would say, unsophisticated young person from a very poor community, and she thought that the arts and speech and drama would help me find a way through life, to gain self-confidence, to learn how to convince people of what my opinions were, to learn to express myself, and finally to deal with the searing racism that was a factor when I grew up. And so she gave me that as a student, and as a consequence of that, I think today to be a leader is one thing, but to be comfortable in your leadership is quite another. And she gave me that comfort with who I am and how I can express myself as a leader. And so I would say that probably that is one of the most important events of my life, and she is still today one of the most important people who mentored me along the way. She came to my office once when I was at Princeton, and my staff were very alarmed because they thought that she must be very elderly, and so they gave her a place to lie down and all of that, because if she was my high school teacher, she had to be ancient, right? But she is in fact still very active and working. She's the director of a theater in Pittsburgh today, and is still one of the most important people in my life.
Thank you. Let's stick with the theme of early life experiences or events that have had a lasting impact, and talk to Paul Farmer. Paul, obviously you've dedicated your life to raising health standards of health care really around the world. Your work, including with Jim Kim in Haiti and Peru and other countries, treating HIV/AIDS, treating malaria, treating drug-resistant tuberculosis, and many other areas has been extraordinary. But years before all this, you were an undergraduate student at Duke University. Now, did I get that school right?
You got that right.
Okay.
I wasn't Smith in any case.
I see I'm going to have some trouble with this panel today. Can I take you back, Paul, to that time in your life, which was, you know, as many of our students just coming back to Dartmouth now, or starting Dartmouth now, same age, same time period, and could you reflect back, think back at some of the things that happened then that might account for where the passion, the energy, and the uncompromising focus, really, of the way in which your career has gone. Were there any triggers or events in that time period you could share with us?
There were. I was lucky enough to be here with the freshman class just a few days ago, and Jim, Philia Dahl, and I talked a little bit about, well, I ended up talking about 1983, and but 1983 was the year that I met Jim Kim, the year that I went to Haiti for the first time, the year that I met Philia Dahl, the year that I really got to know Haiti, and that was important. But to get to Haiti, you had to go from somewhere. I mean, I wasn't born in Haiti, although I was raised in Florida. And it was really Duke University, as you're implying. It was really my college years that made all the difference to me. I knew that I wanted to be a doctor, although I don't know why, because I grew up in a family, a large family, and we didn't have health insurance, by the way. And this is another problem that I know will be focused on by Jim Kim during his presidency, as it is by so many faculty here. We didn't have health insurance. So why I would want to be a doctor, having had almost no experience with a physician, I have no idea. I did break my arm once. I was reading the paper this morning and heard again the story of what a great athlete Jim was in high school. Can I say to the other Dr. Kim, I'm so tired of those stories about Jim on the gridiron. That would be Jim's mother. In any case, I was playing football with my brothers and broke my arm. And I remember my father saying to me, I was in, I think, 6th or 7th grade, "That's okay, I'll set it myself." Now, my father also didn't have a doctor, and had never been a doctor, was a school teacher, unemployed at the time. And I said, "Dad, I'd rather you not set my broken arm." So one can look at these unbroken chain of events and try to make sense of them, but what I did know is I wanted to be a doctor. Why, I don't know. And I went to Duke, was a science major, was very interested in science, biochemistry, and then I took a class. And you know, I'd like the undergraduates here to hear this, because it was really, just as with President Simmons, it was a teacher who made a difference. I took a class called medical anthropology, and it really changed my life. I said, that's the kind of thing I want to understand. And I started, at Duke University, I did a project, my first serious research project. I was 20 years old, maybe 20 years old, and I started going to Duke University emergency room. And this is really on the heels of American, you know, Jim Crow South, and Duke was a hospital where everyone went. And so it was 70, 80% African Americans, and trying to sort all of this out and understand the history of the other hospitals, and interviewing patients who came in with minor health issues, came into an emergency room of a major American medical center, just trying to understand that. And I made tons of mistakes. You know, I had no idea. Actually, I misinterpreted all that I saw for the first couple of years. But it was that class and that experience that actually led me to Haiti, and then from Haiti, here I am at Dartmouth. How did that happen? So a class, to all of you undergraduates, be open to really letting reading, you know, the material that you read. And Jim has always been like this, by the way. Let it be open to letting it change your life. It changed mine.
Thank you. Well, there's someone who has a couple of people here that have a lot of Dartmouth college experience, and so I want to turn to Jeff Immelt, CEO of General Electric. And I've got to ask you much the same vein about some of your own experiences, and maybe thinking about Dartmouth, already referenced by Jim. You're on the football team. You're also the president of Phi Delta Alpha. No doubt an interesting experience in and of itself. What springs to mind that you are willing to share with the rest of us from those years?
I was going to say I have many stories I could share today, but some of those have actually been sealed. But in the spirit of Jim's inauguration, what I thought I'd do is, so I came here, really it was the vision of, I have to say my parents, who, you know, my father from a very early age said, you know, in this country, an education was the great equalizer, right? It could make a poor man rich. And so he was very much, his vision is what led me to this place. And I grew up in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I was, you know, early on, kind of what helped me get here was financial aid. And so in financial aid, you kind of work your way up the food chain. So my first job on financial aid was I worked in the dining hall. I was a blue coat, which was the entry position. And my boss was actually Diana Taylor. She's also on the board. Diana's in the front here. She was a green coat. So she was my, so that was my freshman year. I worked in the dining hall. And my sophomore year, I refereed basketball games. So I was kind of moving progressively in my career on financial aid, kind of slowly up the ladder. And then my junior year, I was a math major, and we just had a great math department in those days. And so I was a math major, so I got to grade papers. And so my assignment, winter term, was a class I had taken the year before, which I really liked, was mathematical models in the social sciences. And the teacher that semester was going to be John Kimmening, who was the president, only the president of the college, right? You know, one of the most famous mathematicians. And so I was going to grade his papers, right? So, you know, very few things actually in my lifetime have ever scared me. I was scared. You know, the idea of going in front of him and describing the problem of the week and things like that. So I went the first time and I was prepared, and he you know, sat down and said, well, tell me about yourself. He said, you know, I said I played football, I'm a math major. I said, are you in a fraternity? I said, geez, is this a trick question? should I, let's see, what are the possible outcomes of answering this question? I said, yeah, I'm in Phi Delta. He said, you know, I've met some of your brothers from Phi Delta, mainly at 3 a.m. in the morning, but other than that, you know. And so it began a weekly rhythm of grading papers, and, you know, I think after a couple sessions, he found that I wasn't going to do anything horribly wrong, that he knew a lot more than I did about any one of the problems or anything we're working on. I wasn't going to lead anybody astray. And then he would spend that hour, 10 minutes asking which students are having trouble, and 50 minutes asking me questions about the college, about what was going on, what was happening, what I thought. And I learned something that has stuck with me through the rest of my career, is that the smartest people in the world ask more questions than they answer. And I saw that in John Kimony, I saw it in Jack Welch, I've seen it in every great leader I've ever been around. Great leaders know how to ask great questions and are always learning.
Great, thank you. Thank you. Michael Porter, terrific to have you on the panel, and welcome you also to the Tuck School, which might be your North Campus one day if we get our way, right, Jim? You've always written about competitiveness, and
I'm wearing my green tie.
Reference Ed for green. You've always written about competitiveness, and you know, in reviewing some of your background, I discovered you were quite the golfer, All-American in golf in college, and makes me wonder how another terrific local golfer might match up against you. I'm thinking of Jim Kim, of course, but that's a topic for another time, no doubt. Can you share with us an anecdote or an example from your years growing up or in college that was pivotal in the direction you ended up taking?
Well, first of all, there's so many, and I think that's an important starting point for all of us, and that is that sometimes there's one moment that changes everything and determines everything, but more likely it's accumulation of things. And it's scary to look back because they each individually were seemingly random or lucky, and then they accumulate to something. My defining characteristics as a young person growing up in high school was I was an athlete. That's what I did. Athlete, athlete, athlete. I played every sport at a pretty high level. And then I was actually recruited to Princeton to play football, but my father was an engineer, and I decided that I was going to be an engineer. So I set out to get an aerospace and mechanical engineering degree. But I was so scared about going to Princeton and trying to be an engineer that I decided I wouldn't play any of my normal sports, football, baseball. I would go out for the golf team. And golf had kind of been a hobby, and fortunately I was pretty good at it. And so this whole thing of varsity sports and being on a team, and particularly a sport like golf, which is really a game of strategy. It's not a physical game, it's a mental game. And once you get to a certain level of golf, hitting the shots is not the problem. The problem is controlling your emotions, taking good risks. And so that was, I think, one piece of the equation. So I get to Princeton, and I'm on the golf team. And then Jeff, I just can't believe it. You know what? I had to get a student job because I was on financial aid. Guess where I worked? In the dining hall. Here's the difference. I never got out of the dining hall. So I started out running the dish machine, and then I started waiting. By the time I graduated, I was actually running the students at the dining hall, hundreds of students at the dining hall. That is the only reason I got into Harvard Business School. I had good grades in engineering, but basically I had risen and I had proved that I had some managerial, potential, and I actually learned something about organizations and how things work. So the student job, in a sense, was a seminal event. And then I got to HBS, and I encountered another really serious problem, and that is at HBS we discuss cases, and at least 50% of your grade is based on what you say in class, day after day after day. And all of us HBS faculty, we mark every student's participation every day. So this is a big deal, And so here I was, an engineer. I'd never spoken in class for 4 years. All I did was just, do problem sets and solve equations. And so I was terrified. I was just like completely dysfunctionally terrified by sitting there in the HBS classroom, All these smart young students were raising their hand, these British kids that were so articulate, and here I was, this engineer, I couldn't see anything. And there was just this pit in my stomach. Literally every day I would go to class with a pit in my stomach. What am I going to do, you know? And you know what changed that? It changed overnight. I had a professor by the name of C. Roland Christensen. Any HBS folks here will have heard that name. C. Roland Christensen was the greatest case method teacher of all time, revered guy, happened to be a strategy professor. One day before class, he always got there early. One day, he's this very unassuming guy from Iowa. He sort of tiptoes up to me in his white shirt with rolled up sleeves, hands me a note. I hadn't said anything in class. I was terrified. It was a nightmare, you know. That note said something like, Mr. Porter, you have a lot to contribute to this course. I can tell. I'd like to hear more from you. Okay? How did he ever write that note? How did he decide to give that note to me? I didn't deserve it. I mean, I didn't do anything, I didn't think to deserve it. That note completely transformed my entire Harvard Business School career. I became probably overly talkative in class because I had the confidence to do it because of what he'd instilled in me. And of course, since he was a strategy professor and since I was captivated by the material he was teaching, you know, I set out to do work in that field. And the rest is kind of another story for another time. But you can see how these journeys have these sort of inflection points. And I think what I would leave the story with is the sense that when these things happen to you or when you have an opportunity, I think you just have to let yourself go with it. And I was able to go with it, and ultimately I started out to be a professional engineer. I ended up being an academic. How could that have happened? It happened because of a series of these events, and a professor was kind of fundamental to the process.
Thank you, thank you. Ed Haldeman. I got to know Ed during the presidential search committee and really enjoyed those interactions, so I hope, Ed, you don't mind my sharing this. But I've also written a couple of books on organizational and leadership failures, including one called Why Smart Executives Fail. So when you accepted the job as CEO very recently, this summer, I think, at Freddie Mac, the big government-sponsored mortgage company that's been in trouble, I sent Ed a congratulatory email, and his response was just vintage. Ed, I'll quote, "Having read closely your last book, my #1 objective at Freddie is not to be a chapter in your next book."
That's absolutely true.
Ed, your career has been stellar. You've never shied away from the big challenges, whether it's been CEO position at Putnam, chair of the Dartmouth trustees, and now CEO at Freddie Mac. Can you share with us an example or a story from your earlier years, maybe from Dartmouth or otherwise, that really had this outsized influence in your own career?
Sure. Not surprisingly, the pivotal moment for me occurred here in Hanover at Dartmouth. I came to Dartmouth in 1966, and my goal was to be successful in some sense. That was, like Jeff, that was our parents' dream in those days. And for me, it was a little bit like check the box. I mean, what we had been taught since we were young was you do well in high school so you can go to a good college and then maybe go to graduate school and you'll be able to be a doctor or a lawyer. And quite candidly, that's where I was when I arrived here. And I wanted to hedge myself because I didn't know what it was to be a doctor or a lawyer or a business person. So I elected to major in economics, but to follow the pre-med curriculum so that was a possibility. And so I did organic chemistry and all physics and all the things that one has to do while majoring in economics. And an economics professor had an incredible impact on me and my future career, and that was Professor Campbell, who is still living today. My wife and I had dinner with him in June, And he taught money and banking here for many, many years. I think we called it ECI 26 and 46. I think the numbers stick with me. That's incredible, because it was a while ago. And he made economics come alive for me. And I can remember in a small classroom with a small number of us, him at the front, and drawing graphs on the chalkboard and showing us the connection that the Federal Reserve could buy Treasury bills or sell Treasury bills, and that would go through a series of causalities which would ultimately lead to changes in the employment rate and whether people had jobs or not, or the inflation rate. And I remember that he had office hours, open office hours, where I could walk in without an appointment and just have him walk through that causality with me when I didn't quite get it. And for me, that made learning come alive, and it was more than, education was more than just checking a box, and I really could see how study and understanding economics and being out in the business world could change people's lives. And I guess I have to say that the same sort of thing didn't happen to me in organic chemistry. And I didn't see that causality, and I didn't see the connection to patients, but I did see it with Professor Campbell, and that, I think, is a big reason that I elected the career that I chose.
Really, the remarkable commonality, as we all kind of go around here, is the power of a teacher as a mentor, or teachers as mentors, which is in some ways why we do what we do, I think. And also the modest upbringing and backgrounds of so many folks here, myself included. My parents never graduated high school, and just there's a drive to make something happen. And it's the college years, but it's also some of the experiences during college years. And just want to ask one more question on this general topic to Paul Farmer. Paul, in an address to students at MIT, you said, "Haiti has been my greatest teacher. No offense to my teachers at Harvard." No doubt if you had gone to Dartmouth, your experience would have been different. But what's the message to students that are here today, or that will be watching on YouTube later, about the importance of experiencing life beyond the classroom?
You know, I'm going to get to introduce Jim tomorrow, and I thought a lot about this already, I have to say, you know, because here you are in a fairly, if you'll pardon the expression, guys, fairly isolated place. Now, I think this is okay coming from someone who grew up in a place called Weeki Wachee, Florida, where the population of Weeki Wachee was measured in hundreds. So, you know, I never got if it's Muscatine or Muscatine, Dr. Kim, but Muscatine, it was a big, Iowa was a big city compared to that. So, but, you know, Dartmouth is in this, you know, tranquil oasis, and, you know, people can feel, the students, and I'm sure the faculty can feel cut off from the great wide world, the things that they're thinking about, whether that be global warming or persistent global poverty or the economic crisis or violence, or on and on the list goes. Global health obviously has been the big one for me and Jim. But, you know, you can't be fooled that these are artificial, sort of an artificially bucolic, and not Dartmouth itself, but the idea of an island of privilege where you can actually do something important. And Ruth and I, and all of us have talked about the importance teachers have had and materials that we have had that have influenced us. But that said, you know, Dartmouth is in a town, which is Hanover, and which is in an area of this country, which is, you know, New England, New Hampshire and New England. And we're in a country where you've seen the impact of some of the work of Dartmouth faculty on the national discussion of the healthcare crisis. That's work that was done here. It's work that was done in this, you know, sea of privilege, meaning protected space that, you know, that is Dartmouth College, but it's had enormous impact already on the national discussion, and I think it will have much more. So, you know, yes, Haiti was my greatest teacher, but I was prepared for Haiti, just as Brown prepared Jim for his later work at Harvard and in Korea and in Haiti and elsewhere in the world. And I think that's what I don't know if I was, what I was saying at MIT, I have no idea where you found that, but it frightens me a little bit. This whole YouTube era frightens me, I must say. But I do think that that's an artificial distinction in a way, and that you know, students, like faculty, need to feel engaged with the world's problem, whether that be, you know, someone who lacks access to health care here in this state or in the northern reaches of this country, or you know, a place that's linked to us in different ways, you know, like Haiti has been.
You know, let's pick up a little bit on some of what Paul was talking about, and actually, of course, the overall theme for our panel, Leadership for Social Change. I've been at the Tuck School of Business for about 15 years, and I've seen a huge change in our student body in that time period, and I suspect, Mike, at HBS, you've seen also something quite similar. So many of our students come in with nonprofit backgrounds, plan careers in a nonprofit arena, and they are not necessarily the same people. Actually, I asked some of the students in my class the other day, how many of you sit on a nonprofit board, and a quarter of the hands came up, and this is average age 28. So people care about this, and places like Dartmouth, like Tuck, and other places like this around the country really are developing a tremendous critical mass of talent. Young talented people that are motivated to take on the world, and the question, and that have skill sets to do it. And the question I'd like to ask the panel, maybe starting with Ruth Simmons first, how do we marshal and leverage this talent, these people, these motivated young people, whether they are graduate students or undergraduate students alike, to bring this idea of leadership for social change really to life?
Well, if I may, I'll go back to something that Paul said about the importance of these kinds of environments, because there are always problems to be solved. That's to be sure. And it's very tempting for young people to think that they've got to get out there and do it right away. But the crises that we will face over time will keep coming. And now we know that these crises are ever more complex. They require a lot more than we've ever had to give before. So I really believe very powerfully that the important thing for us to say to students is that where they are is important. What they can gain from the time that they have to study will be drawn on for decades in their lives, and that it's important to mine that very successfully as students. Having said that, I think the phenomenal thing is that the students, as you say, come in wanting to solve world problems and being aware that they can have an influence on a whole range of different problems. And that seems to me to be the opportunity for all of us who have the important opportunity to influence the direction of young lives, to encourage them to get started and to develop the skills to be able to solve those problems. Last year at Davos, I chaired a session for not-for-profits right in the middle of the economic crisis. And as you might imagine, these leaders of not-for-profits around the world were in that room trying to figure out what to do, how to solve the problems that they were inevitably facing as a result of the fundraising environment that was going to be very limited. And they were discussing some things that they should have been discussing, you know, a couple of years before. And that is, they have to draw on all of their skills and all of their knowledge and work across different types of institutions to be able to solve the problems we have today. One of the problems we have, of course, in universities is we're so specialized. And it's very difficult to draw people together to solve problems. That gets to be much bigger and harder when you're in the real world, because then you're drawing from different agencies competing against each other in government, for example. You're trying to solve problems across different companies. This is very, very hard to do. And I think trying to encourage the students to look beyond those barriers, those silos, to really develop knowledge of widely different areas, skills in interacting across those areas is probably the best thing we can do for the future of the world. Last year, when things unraveled, I think a lot of us were very surprised that people who understood economics pretty well couldn't agree on what was happening. And as I like to say to my faculty in economics, you know, it's not enough just to be an economist. You have to understand a lot about human behavior in order to figure out what's going on in the world. So I think a variety of skills, how to relate to human beings, how to understand human behavior, and that's one of the reasons I think it's so important for people to study art and literature, to be familiar with culture, because you can't understand human behavior if you don't understand those things.
Yeah. You know, I like to pick up on one special point that you made about the value of specialization, but also the cost associated with it. You use the term silo management. I want to ask Mike Porter about this, because I know in a lot of your work in healthcare, you've understood the importance of bringing different skill sets, different types of expertise, different areas of talent together. And actually, you know, two CEOs sitting here as well, the challenge of getting specialization and coordination at the same time in an organization is as fundamental as any. That's why we end up with complex matrix structures and all kinds of other things that are necessary. So let's turn to Michael Porter and ask you maybe to pick up on the theme a little bit of coordination and specialization, but also more generally leadership for social change. What does that mean for you?
Well, let me see if I can migrate my way back to coordination and specialization. But actually, when you asked the question in the beginning, what immediately entered my mind, and some of what we faculty members try to do when we're succeeding, is we try to kind of infuse our students with kind of a passion and a set of values that they should try to make a difference on some of these, you know, important social issues. And there's a lot of them, you know, education and poverty. We've talked about them already. And I suspect the enormity of them is more obvious today than ever before, partly because we're in a global economy and we see much more what happens in all these other parts of the world, and we see the tremendous disutility of that. So I think making social change starts with the passion to want to do it, you know, to really care, and that's in a sense a values issue. But I think what I've come to understand is that if that's going to be successful, and this is something Jim and I have been talking about a lot lately, you've got to move from values to value, if I can do a play on words. That is, it's not enough just to care. The act of giving isn't enough. You've actually got to figure out how to achieve results, how to achieve good outcomes. And this is one of the problems in the nonprofit sector, that too often people believe that if we just do it, if we just have an HIV program in some developing country and we give a lot of people drugs, well, that's a success. Even if the people that you're giving the drugs to don't ultimately have a good outcome.
It's about delivery.
It's about delivery. Thank you, Paul. It's about delivery.
The mic has to work.
This guy is just, you know, he's got another career. His next chapter. Anyway, so I think you start out with a passion to do something good, but you have to approach that with an outcomes results mindset. Yeah. And that actually then leads you to some other, I think, fundamental points, and that is that what we find is that in order to really make substantial social change, it almost all starts with ideas. You've got to have a new, robust way of looking at it that actually bridges effort with results. And you've got to be willing to kind of engage in the actual practice of the actual nitty-gritty of confronting or being close to and getting involved in the actual phenomena you're trying to help. And we have so many people in the social sector believe that they can sit in an office in New York City, in a wonderful office, and think great thoughts about education or whatever. But you know, Paul's case is a wonderful example. I mean, you know, you try to help people in Haiti who are desperately poor and desperately ill, and it's the act of being in the field and engaging practice that ultimately is successful. And to conclude, I just want to put in a pitch for business school. that, you know, a lot of the problems of making social change are managerial problems. They're problems of getting teams to work together. They're problems of actually measuring how well you're doing. They're problems of making sure that your revenues are greater than your expenses. And so I think that, you know, as we think about social problems, I think we need to understand that a full set of tools are necessary, not just more traditional tools, but also managerial tools. And I think all of the students here at Dartmouth, in one way or another, I think if they're serious about making a tremendous social impact in their careers, I think they need to assemble these perspectives and these skills together.
Ed, you want to pick up this theme on leadership for social change and how you think about it?
Yeah, particularly how to influence young people, because I think there is a possibility that when we talk about social change, students here might think one is talking about trying to redirect their careers and have no one go into business or private equity or investment banking, and that we have to refocus everyone in a different direction. And I have a somewhat broader view that one can materially impact the country, the world, through all kinds of different careers, depending on how you execute that career. I think one organization I know that has a model that is attractive to me is Teach for America, and I know lots of our students each year go into Teach for America, and to be sure, those students do incredibly good work during the 2 years that they are course folks in Teach for America and doing the teaching. But a big part of the theory, as I understand it, that Wendy Kopp put together, was the influence that those people can have later on in their lives when they become lawyers or business people or investment bankers, that for the rest of their lives they will carry with them the importance of public school education and the need to have a more equal playing field in terms of public school education. And it seems to me that in all walks of life, one can be responsible for social change. There's a man, I spent my life in investment management, mutual funds, and you would think that really not very possible that one could do much good in that area. And yet, and yet there is a guy who's always impressed me, and that's a guy named Jack Bogle, who is out of Philadelphia and the founder of Vanguard Funds. And for his entire life, back into the 60s, he's been focused on trying to get investors to diversify their holdings, to invest passively, worry about fees, and it has had a huge impact on the investment of millions and millions of Americans and made their lives better. The fees in our country are way down because of him. Index investing is now a third of all our assets. One person has had a huge impact on the savings and investments of millions and millions of Americans. And he has just been someone who has preached that vision and affirmed it repeatedly. He's made a big difference. So I think that's an example of how one can impact and make social change in all areas of activity. Jeff?
I'd like to echo something that Michael said, and my great dream for Jim is that Jim is a systems thinker. I was a student of Michael's many years ago, and what I loved about Michael was that he was a systems thinker. And I think for the students and the faculty here today, I think designating, change and social change as two different buckets is a losing proposition. And I like just what Michael said is that I think the extent to which we can achieve alignment across disciplines and across problems is the extent to which they actually get solved. In some way, shape, or form, I'd say for the last 10 years, I've been thinking about, I'd say in my part of the world, 4 problems. One is, could technology create clean energy and energy security. The second one was, could you build a profitable healthcare business while the cost of healthcare actually goes down, quality goes up, and access improves? The third one was, could you build a profitable business by serving the needs of the emerging world, which is going to be the biggest economic force in most of the students in this room's life? And the fourth was, could the standard of living for an average person in India go up 100-fold in the next generation without the standard of living of Americans actually going down? And if you believe that each issue has to be segregated between what's good for business or what's good for profit and what's good for society, you won't solve any of them. You will fail on all four of them. 2004, we started an initiative. I was sitting around listening to business reviews, and I saw a lot of different businesses were working on the need to reduce carbon, the need for energy security. I didn't really know much about it at the time. And I, 27 years with GE, I grew up really actively disliking most environmentalists, who had actually, I thought, got in the way of almost every good idea, and didn't know much about global warming, and thought it was all about compromise. And even though I went to Dartmouth and it has a great outdoorsy, really, I've never camped in my life. Really, the closest thing I get to nature is golfing. But we created 4 teams. I went to our research lab and I created kind of a red team and a blue team. The red team to advocate for global warming was a fact, the blue team to advocate against it. I had a team that studied customers, a team that studied public policy, a team that studied science and technology. And we launched an initiative called Eco-Imagination, which the basic thesis was green is green. In other words, if through technology we can deliver on products that drive clean energy future, we will make a lot of money for our investors and we'll be doing something good at the same time. Turns out it works. Turns out it works. So my dream for Jim is that he turns Dartmouth into a place that believes in systems thinking. And my dream for this faculty is that they listen to that. And my dream for the students is the fact that they embrace these problems, not with this ugly rhetoric we hear today that just tries to create everything about scarcity and who loses, but drives real thinking, real curiosity, real innovation to really drive social improvement and do it while thriving economics take place at the same time. And that's possible.
Paul, more than anyone else sitting on the panel, perhaps in the room, with the possible exception of Jim Kim, you've dedicated your life to change and social change. And I'd like to get your views on what the next step is going to be as you think about the work you've done, the work you've done with Jim, the work you continue to do, all under the auspices of thinking about leadership and social change.
I want to pick up on what Jeff said, because you can't be involved, I don't think, in medicine and be a Luddite. You can't be against you can't have this balkanized view that Jeff said was bad. It's bad for social change, it's bad in the social sector, it's bad in medicine and public health. To believe that everything is a competition between scarce resources is going to doom a lot of the work that Jim has worked on, or I would work on, or many of us work on. It will doom it to failure to have that kind of. We need just as much in global health, for example, that commitment to the bigger vision. And you asked me what that was, but I just want to say I feel that what I'm saying is really echoing what Jeff said. He said green is green. I understood the metaphor. Actually, Harvard's pretty savvy. They have quite a Harvard, they have a slogan there that I see at the medical school all the time. Green is the new crimson. So here it's just green is the new green at Dartmouth. But I think where we're going is, again, systems thinking. in medicine, you know, the interaction with an individual patient, whether that be in Haiti or at Harvard, you need to be attentive, you need to be listening to what patients have to say. But if you can't take that individual experience and put it into an interpretive grid that is really systems thinking and drawing on the evidence, then you're not doing your patient a service. You know, you could be the most compassionate person in the world, but if you don't know the literature, if you don't know the data, if you don't know what's going to help that person in terms of prevention, diagnosis, or care, you're going to do a disservice to the patient. I see global health the same way. You know, if we cannot apply systems thinking to, and this is why, as Jim said, we asked Mike to spend time with us in rural Haiti. We said, go to the clinics, see how this is done, help us find ways of doing it better. And that's really the future of a lot of these initiatives. And I'll give one specific example. And then, you know, if we fight for an idea, and that idea, the grand idea is, let's say, social justice, equity, fairness, whatever you call it. And some of these words are sort of tarred inappropriately, I might add. But it's fine to say social justice, the idea that, you know, people deserve a fair shot just because they're humans and they're on the earth. You take an idea like that and let it drive forward a program. And Jim has been a master at this in my experience working with him. The implications of saying, well, you know, it's not a good idea to say you can't treat cancer in rural Rwanda. What if cancer is a big problem in rural Rwanda? What if it is, by the way? So that's not the good idea. Is no, we need an idea that everyone deserves a fair shot. Then you apply systems thinking. You know, how can we bring down prices because of what pooled procurement? Jim taught me a lot of these things back in the early 90s. And that's a specific example, you know, talking about cancer prevention, diagnosis, and care in rural Africa. A lot of people who are constrained by this idea that we have very limited resources. How many times do you think I hear in the course of a single week, you know, but we're living in a time of, you know, really constrained resources. And what I've tried to do is learn how to say rather cheerfully, mind you, that's another trick. Ruth, how did I do? Cheerfully, yes, that's true, but they're less constrained now than they ever have been before in human history. So what is the new strategy to drive forward the big idea, which is equity and social justice? What are our strategies, you know, to make this a systematic approach to these problems? That's the big future for global health. And I'll just say, to link global health to social justice movement, we're going to have to also get together with those environmentalists Jeff didn't like. I'm kidding. I bet you like them now, don't you, that green is green?
So there are many things I've learned as I've aged, Paul. Yeah, I've mellowed a little.
Bringing together these two big movements, you know, in my line of work, and you know, this happens a lot in universities and colleges. You bring together the social justice movement, people talking about fair trade, and you know, these are young Americans. They care about this stuff, and then bring that together with the movement for environmental justice and, you know, saving the planet. That's going to be where things are going to go forward, and just avoiding this balkanization and saying, you know, if I profit, he or she will not profit. That's not true. Any doctor working like we do in places where we do know that people will be sick if they don't have jobs. And they can't have jobs if we don't have a vibrant industry and growth beyond the sectors that we might work in. So I think that that's where this is moving forward, is a less balkanized view of the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
No offense to the Balkans, because people here at Dartmouth work in the Balkans.
Well, this idea that green is green and all that, we feel a little ownership of that idea around here in this part of the world, and we understand it. It's very compelling thesis from you, Jeff, on the vision. If GE is going that way, I've got to talk to my stockbroker right away. Assuming this is not confidential information.
No, that's, we are equally strong in healthcare too.
So, actually, Jeff, I have dug up more than just a quote from Paul. I have a quote from Jeff as well. And actually, it's quite a powerful one, and then gets to leadership and who are the leaders that are going to enact some of the social change that everyone here has been talking about? Who are your successors and your partners as we move forward? And Jeff, you said this, I guess, in an interview with Charlie Rose in '05. My role is to look at the next generation of leaders and get them ready for what the future is going to bring, no matter what happens. And that's a pretty compelling statement right there. And I'd like to just get some quick reaction from other panelists about how they interpret and translate that idea and what that means to them. Again, my role is to look at the next generation of leaders and get them ready for what the future is going to bring, no matter what happens. Ruth, would you like to?
Well, it won't surprise you that the unifying thought for me in all of this is that whatever you do, you have to have sufficient understanding of the human dynamics and the human qualities in order to be successful at any of this. So I think the system perspective is a very good one, but if you miss out on what it is that motivates us and moves us and challenges us as human beings, you can easily miss the boat on all of that. I'm struck especially by the rapidity with which things are changing in our world, and how much the lives of students in the future will be affected by parts of the world of which they have little knowledge. That is going to change dramatically and increase the complexity of what they are dealing with. I think that, getting back to, this is not a shameless plug for the humanities and the arts, but it is an effort to say that as we get caught up in the issues that are the very practical issues to save the world from destruction, the green issues, the health issues, and so forth, that what we've got to remember to do is to think about the way that we all link together as human beings and find a way to communicate that, to draw people from very disparate parts of the world together, because systems will never solve the problems if we don't do that. So whether it's with Iran or North Korea or Russia or any other part of the world, if you can't make that human connection, then our future is still at risk, no matter how good we get at solving problems, ostensibly. So I think about that a lot, and in talking to my students about that, I like to emphasize that they're at a time in their lives when they get to do that with very little risk to themselves, because you don't do it when you're older. You don't do it very much when you're older. And so being in a community like Dartmouth and having access to a lot of different people who think differently, who believe differently, who come from vastly different parts of the world, we all know that once you get to be successful, you're living in communities in which there's very little diversity, frankly, even now. And unless you make a conscious effort to get out of this small world that you dwell in, then you really don't learn very much about what's going on in the world. So, I think that if you were to become president of the United States or head of any nation, your influence is still circumscribed by who you are as a human being and your capacity to reach other human beings, because you still have to convince people. President Obama is, as far as I can tell, a perfectly magnificent human being, but he can't convince everybody. And so how do you build those skills and work across these divides and help people to see you at that very, very human level that helps you gain entry into their way of thinking and their way of living and their way of functioning? That's a skill that, however good we are as universities, however much knowledge our students acquire, they have to have those skills as well to be successful in solving these problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of something President Kim was quoted as saying in the newspaper the other day. You can't just walk in and tell people what to do. You have to win their hearts.
I've tried that. It doesn't work.
Ed Haldeman?
Yeah, I think Jeff has it exactly right, that an important aspect of the job of running a big institution, a big company, is training the next generation. And I think the only, or certainly an important way that leaders can do that is by example. In the Sunday Times business section this weekend, there was an interview of a female CEO. I wish I could remember her name, but she said that when she first got the job, she went to the department store and she bought some new suits, and one of the salespeople gave her a scarf and told her a very unusual way to tie the scarf. And she came to work the next day with the scarf tied in this very unusual way. And she said by the end of the week, she had met 12 women on her staff who were wearing the scarf precisely in that way. And I think that's an example of how much influence leaders and CEOs can have on the people that they work with. And the example that we set is so critical, so that if one thinks that the kind of approach to leadership and management is to be visible and walk the halls and to be connected to people and break down hierarchy, be really careful with expenses, all of those things are incredibly apparent when the CEO lives that. And so I think that's, if not the only way, it's certainly a major way that you can train leaders is by your own action and the example that you set every day.
Michael Porter.
Well, this question, I think I'm going to learn pick this up. I don't quite understand. This looks like a microphone, but I guess it isn't. Anyway, I'm an engineer. You know, I'd like to, you know, we're trying to get at how can you actually move the needle, you know, on many of these important issues. And I think we've added a lot of richness to that question. You know, I want to come back to Jeff. Where Jeff started, and Paul mentioned this as well. I think we have a tremendous tendency in society, which is reinforced by, you know, kind of academic specialization, to kind of frame many issues in terms of trade-offs. And, you know, the environment was a perfect example. If we're going to improve environmental performance, we're going to have to bear extra cost. It's going to really impose a cost on business. That's kind of there was a religious debate about that. Economists in general 20 years ago said, if you're going to have environmental regulation, there's nothing, it can only drive up cost. That's the only answer. Why? Because if you impose a constraint, and the company is already running well, then that constraint, dealing with that constraint is going to cost more money. So economic theory says that environmental improvement is expensive, and therefore it was fought, you know, tooth and nail by many, you know, very distinguished, very thoughtful people. Instead, I think Jeff has articulated very clearly what we now know, which is that environmental improvement is actually profitable, because almost all forms of energy, unnecessary energy use or pollution is a form of waste. And when you reduce waste, you actually lower your costs. And you can actually improve your quality at the same time. So what we did in this issue of the environment is we're in the process of changing it from a kind of win-lose power struggle between those who believe at all costs that we should improve the environment and those who believe at all costs that we should get government out of the way, to a very different agenda, which is how can we work together to create this win-win outcome? Improving energy efficiency and reducing carbon emissions while actually making businesses work more efficiently and more productively. And I've come to see how in issue after issue, it is the same problem. We have a tendency to frame issues as a struggle over who wins and who loses. In my personal, one of the most meaningful things I've ever tried to do is try to work on the issue of urban poverty. You know, poverty in America is concentrated in our urban areas. I think something like 30% of all minority poverty is in what we call inner cities, or the distressed urban neighborhoods in the 100 largest cities of America. And there's been a long effort in America to deal with that problem. And, you know, and one way of dealing with it, of course, is redistribution. We need to, you know, take money from some and give it to the others who need it. Another issue is preferences. So there was a big movement 15 years ago to kind of give businesses in these locations a sort of a preference in terms of purchasing. And there's some good reasons to continue doing that, but doing it very, very carefully. What I think we've come to understand is that no, you can't solve the problem that way. The only way you can solve the problem of urban poverty is really to help inner city residents build successful businesses and get access to jobs that will pay a living wage. That's a very different framing of the problem. You know, we used to have intergalactic war about these earlier solutions because they were win-lose solutions. One group saw it losing and the other group was winning. But everybody can agree that every American should have an opportunity and the assets to try to build a business and create jobs and improve their lot economically. That's a win-win opportunity. That benefits us all. So I think I've learned over the years that we have to turn these issues not into a struggle and a political war over ideology, or we have to take a very much more pragmatic perspective. How can we actually create shared value? How can we create win-win outcomes where we can actually deal with the underlying problem and actually everybody can benefit? Jeff's company is a marvelous example of trying to do that. And in each of those 4 areas he articulated, that's the way he framed the question. In healthcare, we are trying to do the same thing in the work that I've been doing with Paul and Jim. So that would be a perspective on how do you think about these issues. Now then there's a whole set of questions about how to lead, and I defer to the leaders to continue that discussion.
Thank you. One more agenda item for us, and so we have Jim Kim, our new president, 17th president of Dartmouth, and I think with this group right here, we should be giving him some advice on how to do his job. And I'm gonna start with Paul Farmer, who knows Jim Kim better than anyone here. Paul, what is your advice for Jim as he begins his tenure at Dartmouth?
I've been giving Jim advice for 25 years. He's not listened yet, so I don't see why I should be the first one to start. Yeah, that's not true. It's true about the 25 years. You know, I think that Jim, I've been listening to what he's been saying, you know, publicly, and you know, I just think he's really on the right track. I think he's, and I know this is not what you wanted, you know, you wanted specific advice. I mean, I'm lucky enough to have regular contact with Jim, but the vision of the university is there. Of the Dartmouth College. You know, this is a place with a real commitment to excellence and to focusing on education and on each other. And this, I think, is back to Ruth's point. It's something that Jim told me, and I believe it to be true. You know, the civility, the looking out for one another, creating a climate of decency, or sustaining a climate of decency, and really just kindness to one another. And, you know, that's the kind of leadership that I think Jim will embrace and should embrace, is creating, you know, leadership as creating a space so that other people can lead, namely the students and faculty here. And so that's advice that we've given each other before. And, you know, back to what draws us all together is Jim, and believing that we have to transmit the lessons that we learn and the appreciations that we have. And I'm going back to, you know, the humanities and history and the arts. The appreciations, we have to transmit that to the next generation. And, you know, Jim's clearly made a commitment to that, or he would not be taking the job of 17th president of the university. So I think this is going to be a great run for Dartmouth and for Jim. And as long as he embraces those two approaches that he's long had. One, you know, real leadership is letting other people have space in which to lead, and two, you know, keep on being committed to transmitting this knowledge to people younger, and with lower golf handicaps or whatever, whatever sports metaphor we're about to hear from Jeff and Mike. No,
Well,
I'm kidding. I'm jealous because one of my I'm the shrimp of my family, and one of my brothers became a professional wrestler on television. And by the way, when I told you the story about breaking my arm and not having insurance, and my father wanted to set it, it was one of my mammoth brothers who broke it. So I have trauma around sports.
Well, hopefully Jeff Immelt won't pile it on too much. And what's your advice for Jim Kim?
Well, first, I'd be remiss if I didn't, I know there's students here today, and what a special place Dartmouth is. It's really so great to be with you today. I think my dream for you is that you love driving change, and that you are determined to take the gift you've been given here and make a tremendous difference in the world. It's just a fantastic place. There's a lot of things to be worried about. What's the economy? Am I going to be able to get a job? Stuff like that. I'd say just be cool. These things have a way of working themselves out. Be cool, and if you like solving big problems and earning money for investors at the same time, I'll hire you at the end. But be cool. Enjoy your time here. These will work themselves out. And for Jim, I'm so thrilled you're here. Dartmouth is rapidly approaching its 250th anniversary. I've worked for a company that's 130 years old, founded by Thomas Edison, one of the great Americans. And I would say that frequently, both in GE and in Dartmouth, people talk about tradition. And tradition is really important, don't get me wrong. But I think if you want to build an enduring institution, there are maybe only 3 traditions that count. One is a commitment to integrity, complete transparency and honesty in everything you do. The second one is a commitment to performance, that there's no blinking about what it takes to be successful, that there's a tough-mindedness that goes with intellectual honesty. And the third one is a commitment to change, to never being satisfied with what's been in the past, but a desire to transform. I know in you we're going to have all 3. And that this tradition isn't about what the curriculum is, and isn't about what the symbol is, and it isn't about any of this other stuff. Those are background noise. It's about integrity, performance, and change. And I stand ready to help you however I can in this incredible journey that you're going to lead us in.
Michael Porter.
Well, Jim, unfortunately, I don't have GE behind me. I can't hire anybody. But Jeff, what a warm and generous and inspiring answer to that question. I'm not going to surprise anybody with my advice. Jim, have a strategy. And what that means is don't try to do everything for everybody. Don't try to do what other Ivy League schools are doing. Think about what's actually unique about this institution, what strengths it has to build on, and then kind of chart a course that is modern and forward-looking and builds on those to deliver, really true excellence and something truly unique. I think that Dartmouth has a great platform. There's enormous assets, and I think you're already starting to kind of articulate what that strategic vision might be, and I think that's kind of step number 1. I would echo something that Jeff said. Drive for the outcomes, for the performance. I think in the universities, and I'm a university person, we have not been performance-oriented. We have sort of believed that we're all entitled to be there and to do whatever we choose to do, and that's faculty and administrators and often students. And we've got to hold ourselves to a higher standard. Our university system is incredibly expensive. It's unsustainable in its current form. We've got to invent some new ways to do what we do. We got to do some non-incremental improvements. And so I think, Jim, if you can have that level of aspiration and add it to what I said earlier, I think that will be extraordinarily important to your time as president. And finally, I would say that energize everything you do here at Dartmouth with a very strong moral purpose. That we're not here to punch the ticket, we're not here to check the box, we're not here to go through the motions. We're here because we're trying to do something really important for the world and for our families and for our community. And I think Dartmouth has a long tradition of that moral purpose, that set of values, that perspective that the university is more than just a place where people read books and take courses. I think if you can keep that sense of moral purpose and update it and renew it with some of these other things that we've talked about this afternoon, I think you'll be enormously successful. And again, I, like all of your friends here on the stage, are ready to stand with you and help in any way we can.
Ruth Simmons.
Oh, it's probably it's difficult for me to give advice to another president, but one of the things that I try always to remember, which took me a while to get there, was that when the board at Brown appointed me, they appointed me. They didn't appoint somebody else. And in a way, I think the most important thing to remember as a president is why you were invited to do the job in the first place, and to try to be true to that, because they don't want something else, they want you. And it's very easy to lose sight of that when things get tough, because you're hearing from 100 different directions things you should be doing that pull you away from who you are. But as soon as you do that, of course you lose your authenticity, and you lose the reason that you were brought to Dartmouth in the first place. So I would say the most important thing for your own mental health and for this community is really to remain who you are. Now, when I started at Smith, I thought, my responsibility is to be everybody's president. And that means that there will be people with whom I disagree, but I still have to represent them, and I have to care for them, and I have to respect them as president. And I thought I had that nailed, absolutely, until the witches came to me and asked me if I would come to their service and participate as a witch in their service. So that isn't to say anything about Dartmouth. It's just to say that you cannot, in your human experience, imagine the different things that will come to you. Impossible to know, impossible to imagine. But in a sense, it doesn't matter, because when you decided to take this on, you decided that you would be the president for everybody. So you'll be the president for the person who thinks you don't deserve to be president of Dartmouth. That's the way it is. And there is something really wonderful in that, and really inspiring in it, because when you have to rise to that level, to appreciate the diversity of opinions, the diversity of perspectives, and know that you can do that and lead a community as vast as this one, you will gain something so immeasurably important that you will be grateful to have done it in the first place. And then finally, I would say that, to this community, You know, the job of president is every day of the week, every night, every weekend. And the communities tend to believe that they own you and they own your time. And it's impossible for them not to feel that way, because they, as you care for them, they care for you, and they want you everywhere. So that's natural. But on the other hand, they don't necessarily feel as generous with you when it comes to your own opinions. And so somebody gave me this advice years ago when I first became president. The advice was to remember that you are entitled to your own opinions, as long as you don't express them. But seriously, communities are all about disagreement too. And one of the things that I hope this community will do is give you room to express your very, very strong views. And to give you room to do things that are different from what they expect. That's very important to you, I know. And it will be important to this community, because I hope one of the things you're going to do, Jim, is, as rich as this community is, as wonderful as it is, you have got to bring people into it. Because I have to go back to Vernell Lilly, and I'll end on this, but honestly, think of it. There are young people out there who will see that you're president of Dartmouth, and they will want, in the worst possible way, to be a part of what you're doing here. They'll want, in the worst possible way, to learn from what you have done. And you'll inspire a whole generation of people out there whom you will never know, because of the simple reason that the board has been wise enough to appoint you, and you have been wise enough to accept. So in that regard, I would say you have to leave room for the time that you will need to serve that public, because they will demand a lot of you, just as people at Dartmouth will.
Thank you. And speaking of the wise board, Ed Holloman.
Jim, my advice would be to inspire the students. I don't know anyone who inspires people as much as you do. Your life story is inspiring. The work that you did at Partners in Health and the World Health Organization is inspirational. Inspire the students. It sounds easy. It's your competitive advantage. You know how to do it. But there are going to be so many demands pulling you in different directions. You're going to be asked to make trips all over the country to speak to alumni clubs, raise money. You're going to have to work on budget issues, tenure cases. You're going to be pulled in so many directions. But I'd ask you to remember, as Ruth said, why you were brought here. What is so special about you is the inspiration you've brought to this community already. And I just urge you to keep that focus and inspire the students. Sid, you've done a lot of thinking about leadership and how you run organizations. I'm sure you've got some advice you'd like to offer to Jim, so maybe you want to take a shot.
Taste of my own medicine. So, certainly listen and learn, and spend the next weeks and months doing that, going to people all over Hanover and all over the country, maybe the world, to learn from different people and understand more about this special place. But don't let anyone tell you that you can't do it. Don't let anyone tell you you can't create a new system of higher education. Don't let anyone say that it's impossible to create a science of healthcare delivery. Don't let anyone tell you that research and teaching are are working at cross purposes. They're in the same way that we heard Paul Farmer talk about, and Jeff Immelt for that matter, about false trade-offs. That's one of those classic false trade-offs. And don't let anyone tell you that Dartmouth can't get better. Good, excellent, yes. Better, absolutely possible. And speaking as a faculty member, more so than a member of the search committee, we didn't bring you in here to bunt and advance the runner to second. You're in the cleanup slot. We put you in the key place. And
is this a baseball metaphor?
Is this a pro-Yankee crowd, or?
We won't say who you're hitting for, but you're the cleanup hitter at Dartmouth, and that means, as I think as Ruth Simmons said, the search committee selected you for a reason, and that reason is to hit it out of the park. And we wish you all the best luck and good fortune in doing that. On that note, I want to thank the panel, Paul Farmer, Michael Porter, Ruth Simmons, Ed Haldeman, and Jeff Immelt for a terrific discussion. Thank you all very much.